Blood. That's all Wyatt Thompson could see as he stared down at his trembling hands in the pale moonlight. The shovel beside him gleamed with fresh earth, and 20 feet away, Clara's terrified eyes reflected the flames consuming what was left of the barn. The acrid smoke burned his lungs, but not as much as the realization clawing at his chest. Everything he thought he knew about love, about redemption, about the very ground beneath his feet, it was all built on a lie so devastating that it would change everything. How do you tell the woman you love that the man you just buried was not just her abusive father, but the key to a secret that could destroy them both? And why was Clara now holding that blood-stained letter, her face pale with a terror he'd never seen before? 3 months earlier, the Montana landscape stretched endlessly under a steel-gray sky, and Wyatt Thompson moved through it like a ghost haunting his own life. At 34, he had perfected the art of solitude. His weathered hands, scarred from years of ranch work, could mend any fence, heal any wounded animal, fix anything broken, except the hollow ache that had lived in his chest for the past decade. The Lazy W Ranch had been his grandfather's pride, then his father's burden, and now his inheritance of isolation. 2,000 acres of prime cattle land, a modest but sturdy farmhouse, and not a single soul for 15 miles in any direction. Most men his age had families, laughter echoing through their halls, children's toys scattered across porches. Wyatt had silence, and he'd convinced himself it was enough. His daily routine was clockwork: up at dawn, check the cattle, mend what needed mending, eat alone, sleep alone, repeat. The townspeople in Cedar Falls knew him as the quiet Thompson, boy who'd never quite recovered from his parents' car accident 10 years ago. What they didn't know was that Wyatt had deliberately chosen this exile. Solitude was safer than the risk of loss, predictable in a way that human connection never could be. The old farmhouse creaked with memories of better times, his mother's laughter from the kitchen, his father's proud voice discussing cattle, prices, the warmth of family dinners around the worn wooden table. Now the only sounds were the wind through the rafters and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. Wyatt had made peace with ghosts, or so he thought. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The October air bit at his face as he rode out to check the northern pasture, his breath visible in small puffs. The landscape was painted in autumn's palette, golden grass, rust-colored leaves clinging to scattered oak trees, and the distant mountains crowned with early snow. It was beautiful in its stark loneliness, matching perfectly the landscape of his heart. But as he crested the hill overlooking Miller's Creek, something was wrong. His horses, usually calm and grazing peacefully, were agitated, bunched together, near the old oak tree by the water. Their ears were pricked forward, alert and nervous. Wyatt's instincts, honed by years of reading animal behavior, immediately went on high alert. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the creek's babble. A whimper, human, female, and filled with such raw pain that it cut through his carefully constructed emotional walls like a blade. If you're already feeling the tension building and want to see how this story unfolds, hit that like button to show your support and give us the motivation to keep going. This is just the beginning, and trust me, you're not ready for what comes next. Wyatt dismounted slowly, his boots silent on the soft earth. The sound came again, definitely human, definitely distressed. Every instinct told him to approach, carefully. In 15 years of ranching, he'd found injured hikers, lost hunters, even the occasional drifter seeking shelter. But something about this felt different, more desperate, more dangerous. Behind the massive oak tree, partially hidden by its gnarled roots, he found her. Clara Whitmore was 19 years old, though the fear in her dark eyes made her seem both younger and infinitely older. Her auburn hair was matted with blood, and ugly purple bruises bloomed across her pale skin like grotesque flowers. Her clothes were torn, muddy, and she clutched a small backpack to her chest as if it contained everything precious in the world. When their eyes met, she didn't run, she couldn't. Her left ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, and exhaustion had pushed her far beyond the point of flight. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "Please don't. Don't send me back." The raw desperation in her voice hit Wyatt like a physical blow. He'd heard fear before, animals caught in traps, cattle during storms, but this was different. This was human terror, refined by intelligence and made more potent by the knowledge of what might come next. "I won't hurt you," Wyatt said softly, crouching down to her level, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "What's your name?" "Clara." The word came out like a confession. Clara Whitmore. The name meant nothing to him then, though later he would wish he'd paid more attention to local news, to the whispered gossip in Cedar Falls, to the stories that traveled through small communities like wildfire. But in that moment, all he saw was a broken girl who needed help. "I'm Wyatt, this is my land, you're safe here." The words came easily, though he had no idea why he was making such a promise to a complete stranger. Clara's eyes searched his face, looking for deception, for the cruel twist that had characterized every male figure in her young life. Instead, she found something she'd never encountered before. Genuine concern without expectation, kindness without condition. "My father," she started, then stopped, her whole body shaking. "He'll come looking. He always comes looking." The fear in her voice told Wyatt everything he needed to know about why she was here, broken and bleeding by his creek. Domestic violence wasn't uncommon in rural Montana, but it never got easier to witness its aftermath. Years later, when everything went to hell, Wyatt would remember this moment as the precise instant his life split into before and after. Before Clara, he was a man content with solitude, convinced that isolation was a form of protection. After Clara, he would learn that some protections came at too high a price, and that the ground you think you know can shift beneath your feet without warning. But that Tuesday morning, all he knew was that he couldn't leave her there. "Can you walk?" he asked gently. Clara tried to stand and immediately crumpled, gasping as her injured ankle refused to bear weight. Without hesitation, Wyatt slipped his arms under her knees and shoulders, lifting her as carefully as he would handle a newborn calf. She tensed initially, every muscle in her body preparing for violence that didn't come. Instead, she found herself cradled against a broad chest that smelled of hay and honest work, carried by arms strong enough to lift her, but gentle enough not to cause additional pain. The ride back to the farmhouse was silent, except for the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves and Clara's occasionally sharp intake of breath when the movement jostled her injuries. Wyatt found himself hyper-aware of her presence, the slight weight of her in his arms, the way she tried to make herself smaller, as if taking up space was somehow dangerous. The farmhouse looked different with her in it. Suddenly Wyatt saw his home through her eyes, the sparse furnishings, the bachelor's lack of warmth, the way silence had become another piece of furniture. But Clara didn't seem to notice the house's shortcomings. She was too busy marveling at the absence of shouting, the lack of tension crackling through the air like an electrical storm. Wyatt settled her on his couch, the same faded blue sofa his mother had loved, and went to work with the quiet efficiency that came from years of treating injured animals. Ice for the swelling, gentle cleaning for the cuts, careful bandaging for the worst of the wounds. His touch was clinical but kind, and Clara found herself relaxing for the first time in months. "Thank you," she whispered when he finished, the words heavy with meaning that went far beyond medical care. "Don't thank me yet," Wyatt replied, though his tone was gentle. "We need to talk about what happens next." What happened next would change both their lives forever, though neither of them knew it as they sat in the fading afternoon light, two wounded souls who had found each other by the slimmest of chances, or what they thought was chance. Because, 20 miles away, in a bar that reeked of stale beer and broken dreams, Frank Whitmore slammed his fist on the scarred wooden table and told anyone who would listen that his daughter was missing, and he'd be damned if he'd let some stranger steal what belonged to him. And in a filing cabinet in the basement of the Cedar Falls Sheriff's Department, a manila folder marked "Thompson Family, Case Closed" held secrets that would eventually explode into the light, revealing connections that went back decades and transformed a simple rescue into something far more complicated and dangerous. But that first evening, as Clara slept peacefully for the first time in years and Wyatt sat in his kitchen staring at 2 coffee cups instead of 1, none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was safe. He was no longer alone, and sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. The autumn wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon. Wyatt had always found the sound lonely. Tonight, with Clara sleeping safely in his guest room, it sounded more like a warning. 2 weeks later. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. Clara's physical wounds were healing, but more importantly, the constant tension that had lived in her shoulders was slowly releasing. She'd started helping around the ranch. Small things. At first, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, helping with simple cooking. Her presence had awakened something in the old farmhouse that Wyatt didn't realize had been dormant. Laughter. The sound of Clara's genuine delight when one of the barn cats had kittens was the first real joy the house had heard in a decade. The way she hummed while making breakfast, unconscious and content, filled spaces that silence had claimed for too long. But it was more than just her presence that was changing things. It was the way she looked at him. Clara had never known gentleness from a man. Her father, Frank Whitmore, was a drinker and a brute who saw his daughter as property rather than a person. The men she'd encountered in her 19 years had been cut from similar cloth, taking what they wanted, giving nothing back, leaving bruises that went deeper than skin. Wyatt was different. His strength was protective rather than predatory. When he worked with the cattle, she saw how the animals trusted him, how his calm presence could settle even the most agitated bull. When he looked at her, she saw respect rather than ownership, care rather than control, and Wyatt, for his part, was falling. He'd thought he understood loneliness, but Clara's presence showed him the difference between solitude and isolation. She brought light into corners of his life he didn't even know were dark. Her curiosity about the ranch, her genuine interest in his work, the way she listened when he talked about his parents or his dreams for the land. It was intoxicating. The evening everything changed started ordinarily enough. They'd worked together to bring the cattle in from the far pasture, a job that usually took Wyatt the better part of a day, but was finished in hours with Clara's help. She had a natural way with animals, fearless but respectful, and watching her work filled him with a pride he couldn't entirely explain. As sunset painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sat on the porch steps, sharing a beer. And the comfortable silence that had developed between them. Clara's ankle had healed completely, and they both knew she could leave any time she wanted. Neither of them mentioned this fact. "I used to dream about places like this," Clara said softly, her voice carrying across the evening air. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere safe." She paused, then added, "I never thought I'd actually find it." Wyatt turned to look at her, and something in her expression made his breath catch. There was warmth there and trust and something deeper that made his heart race. "Clara," he started, not sure what he intended to say. She turned toward him. And suddenly the space between them seemed charged with electricity. Her dark eyes searched his face, and he saw his own feelings reflected there, the careful affection that had grown into something much stronger, the recognition that what they'd found was precious and rare. When he kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who'd thought he'd never feel this way again, and the desperate hunger of someone who'd been starving without knowing it. Clara responded with an intensity that spoke of her own journey from fear to trust, to something approaching love. They made love that night with the tender passion of two people who had found home in each other. Wyatt was achingly gentle, mindful of her past trauma, while Clara brought a fierce joy to their connection that healed wounds in both of them that they hadn't even known existed. But it was the next morning that changed everything. Wyatt woke before dawn, as was his custom, but instead of the usual routine, he found himself watching Clara sleep. Her face, relaxed and peaceful, was beautiful in the pale morning light. For the first time in 10 years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that included someone else. Children running through the halls, family dinners around the old wooden table, growing old with someone who understood him. That's when he heard the trucks. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching at speed was unmistakable. And Wyatt's blood went cold. He'd grown up in rural Montana. He knew the difference between visitors and trouble. This was definitely trouble. Clara woke at his movement, instantly alert in the way of someone who'd learned to sleep with one ear open for danger. "What is it?" she whispered. "Stay here," Wyatt said, reaching for the shotgun he kept by the bed. "Whatever happens, stay in this room." Through the bedroom window, they could see 3 pickup trucks pulled up in front of the house. Frank Whitmore stood by the lead vehicle, and he wasn't alone. The men with him had the hard look of people who enjoyed violence, the kind of men who gravitated toward bullies like Frank. "He found me," Clara breathed, and all the color drained from her face. Wyatt looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just fear but resignation. She expected him to hand her over, expected him to choose the easy path, to avoid the conflict that was now standing on his doorstep. In that moment, Wyatt Thompson made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could play it safe, explain that Clara had just been seeking medical attention, maybe broker some kind of peace. It would be the smart thing to do, the prudent thing. Instead, he pulled Clara close and said the words that changed everything. "Nobody takes you anywhere you don't want to go. Not while I'm breathing." The finality in his voice surprised them both. Wyatt had just declared war on a man he'd never met, for a woman he'd known for 2 weeks. By any rational measure, it was insane. It was also the first decision he'd made. In 10 years, that felt completely right. Wyatt just made a choice that's going to change everything. If you were in his position, would you have done the same? Drop a comment below and let me know what you would have done. I really want to hear your thoughts on this impossible situation. Frank Whitmore's voice carried across the morning air like a rusty blade scraping stone. "Wyatt Thompson, I know you got my girl in there. Send her out and we can keep this civil." There was nothing civil about Frank Whitmore. At 52, he was a man carved from anger and pickled in cheap whiskey. His face bore the permanent flush of someone whose liver was fighting a losing battle, and his eyes held the cruel intelligence of a predator who'd learned to justify his cruelty as righteousness. Wyatt stepped onto his porch, shotgun held low but ready, and got his first look at the man who'd tormented Clara for 19 years. What he saw made his blood boil. This was the face that had haunted Clara's nightmares, the source of every flinch when someone moved too quickly, every apology for taking up space. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go," Wyatt called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Frank's laugh was ugly, devoid of humor. "You think you're some kind of hero, boy. Clara belongs to me. I raised her, fed her, put a roof over her head for 19 years. She's got obligations." "The only obligation she has is to herself," Wyatt replied. Behind Frank, the other men spread out in a loose semicircle. Wyatt counted 5 of them total. Not great odds, but he'd been in worse situations. What concerned him more was the look in Frank's eyes. This wasn't just about retrieving his daughter. There was something else there, something that felt personal and dangerous. "You know, Thompson," Frank said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more threatening than his shouting, "I've been asking around about you. Quiet fella, keeps to himself. Lost his parents real tragic-like about 10 years back." Wyatt's grip tightened on the shotgun. "Get to the point, Whitmore." "Funny thing about that accident," Frank continued. "Car went off the road on a clear night, straight stretch of highway. Your daddy was known to be a careful driver. Makes a man wonder what might have caused such a thing." The words hit Wyatt like physical blows. He'd wondered the same thing for 10 years, had questioned every detail of that night until it nearly drove him mad. The sheriff had ruled it an accident. A deer in the road, maybe, or a moment's inattention. But Frank's tone suggested he knew something different. "You son of a bitch," Wyatt breathed. "What do you know?" Frank's smile was triumphant and cruel. "I know a lot of things, boy, like why your grandfather really bought this land, like what he found buried out there in the north pasture, like what your daddy tried to do about it." He paused, savoring the moment. "Like why Clara ending up here wasn't no accident." The world tilted around Wyatt. Clara, watching from the bedroom window, saw the change in his posture and knew something terrible was happening. The easy confidence he'd shown just moments before was cracking, replaced by confusion and growing horror. "So you're lying," Wyatt said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Frank reached into his truck and pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers and photographs. Your granddaddy was quite the record keeper. Too bad he never told your daddy about what he'd gotten the family into. Frank opened the folder and pulled out a black and white photograph. Even from a distance, Wyatt could see it showed the north pasture, but it looked different. There were buildings there, structures he'd never seen. 1943, Frank called out. Government needed a place to test some things. Quiet place, far from prying eyes. Your granddaddy was paid well to keep his mouth shut and let them use his land. Another photograph. 1951, military pulled out, but they left some things behind. Things they didn't want nobody finding. Wyatt's mind reeled. The north pasture had always been off limits when he was a child. His grandfather had told him the soil was bad there, not good for grazing. He'd accepted that explanation without question. Chemical. Weapons, Frank continued, his voice gaining strength from Wyatt's obvious distress. Nerve gas, biological agents, all sorts of nasty shit buried out there in unmarked containers. Government figured it would stay buried forever. He smiled. But containers rust, don't they? And chemicals seep. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the county's chief medical examiner, had seen cases like this before. In her expert opinion, the symptoms Frank was describing, the gradual poisoning of groundwater, the slow contamination of soil, could indeed cause the kind of systemic health problems that had plagued the area for decades. Environmental contamination from military testing sites is more common than people realize, she would later tell investigators. The government's policy of bury and forget has created dozens of toxic time bombs across the country. Your daddy started figuring it out about 10 years ago, Frank continued relentlessly. Cattle were getting sick, strange cancers showing up in town. He started asking questions, digging around. Government doesn't like it when people ask questions about things that are supposed to stay buried. Wyatt felt the ground shifting beneath. His feet, everything he'd believed about his family and his land crumbling. You're saying they killed my parents. I'm saying your daddy was driving home from a meeting with some federal agents who told him to keep his mouth shut. He was upset driving too fast, maybe. Or maybe those agents decided talking wasn't enough. Frank shrugged. Either way, problem solved. Clara chose that moment to appear on the porch beside Wyatt, her face pale but determined. Whatever lies you're telling, I don't care. I'm not going with you. Frank's expression changed, anger replacing his cruel satisfaction. You ungrateful little bitch. After everything I've done for you, everything I've protected you from, this is how you repay me? Protected me? Clara's voice cracked with emotion. You beat me, you terrorized me, you made my life hell. I kept you alive, Frank roared. You think I hit you for fun? You think I was cruel because I enjoyed it? He gestured toward the folder in his hands. I was making sure you were too scared to go anywhere, too broken to ask questions. Because the day you turned 18, they were supposed to come for you. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara stared at her father, trying to process his words. Come for me, she whispered. You think it was coincidence that your mother died of cancer when you were 5. You think it was bad luck that she got sick so young? Frank's voice was bitter, with years of suppressed knowledge. Your mother grew up on Thompson land, played in those fields as a child, drank from that well, breathed that air for 20 years before we got married. Wyatt felt like he was drowning. What are you saying? I'm saying my wife died from your family's poison, and they've been watching Clara ever since, waiting to see if she'd develop the same symptoms. Waiting to see if she'd start asking the same questions her mother never lived long enough to ask. Frank pulled out another document, this one more recent. Birth certificate, medical records. Your Clara here has been part of a long-term study on environmental contamination effects. A test subject who wasn't supposed to know she was being tested. He looked at his daughter with something that might have been regret. Every beating, every cruelty. It was to keep you too scared to leave town, too broken to wonder why government doctors kept wanting blood samples at school. Clara was shaking now, the truth hitting her in waves. You knew. You knew why they were testing me, and you let them. I kept you alive, Frank repeated, but his voice had lost its strength. The moment you started asking questions or tried to leave permanently, you would have been another accident, another tragic young death in a town full of them. Wyatt looked at Clara, seeing her with new eyes. She wasn't just a victim of domestic violence who'd found sanctuary on his ranch. She was living evidence of a decades-long cover-up, a conspiracy that had killed his parents and poisoned his land. But then she ran, Frank continued. Ran straight to the one place she shouldn't have gone, straight to the source. He looked at Wyatt with something approaching pity. You poor, stupid son of a bitch. You think you saved her? You signed. Both your death warrants the moment you let her stay. As if summoned by his words, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Black shapes appeared on the horizon, growing larger as they approached. Government doesn't like loose ends, Frank said quietly. And you two just became the biggest loose ends of all. If this revelation just blew your mind, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell, because the ending of this story is going to be absolutely insane. You won't believe how this all comes together. The helicopters circled the ranch like mechanical vultures, their rotors whipping up dust devils that danced across the yard. Wyatt pulled Clara close, his mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same dead end. But Frank Whitmore was already moving. "Get down!" he shouted, and to Wyatt's amazement, the older man was suddenly diving toward the porch, his own weapon appearing in his hands. "I ain't done talking." The first helicopter was landing in the north pasture, the same pasture that apparently held decades of buried secrets. Men in tactical gear were rappelling down, moving with military precision toward the farmhouse. "What the hell are you doing?" Wyatt demanded as Frank rolled behind the porch steps. "Changing sides," Frank growled, checking his ammunition. "I spent 19 years keeping my daughter alive by playing their game, but if they're here now, it means the game is over anyway." He looked at Clara with something that might have been love buried under years of regret. "I ain't letting them take her without a fight." Clara stared at her father in shock. "All those years that you were protecting me." "Badly," Frank admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought if I broke your spirit enough, you'd never want to leave, never want to explore, never want to ask questions. I thought I could keep you safe by keeping you afraid." His eyes met hers, and for the first time in her memory, she saw tears there. "I was wrong about everything except one thing. They will kill you the moment you become inconvenient." The tactical team was closer now, surrounding the house with professional efficiency. Through the dust and chaos, Wyatt caught sight of a familiar face and his blood went cold. Sheriff Martin Crawford, the man who'd investigated his parents' death, who'd ruled it an accident, who'd been a family friend for as long as Wyatt could. Remember, Crawford was directing the tactical team with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Crawford's with them," Wyatt said, the betrayal cutting deep. Frank wasn't surprised. Small-town sheriff on a government payroll. How do you think they kept track of everyone for so long? But even as the noose tightened around them, Clara was thinking. Her mind, sharpened by years of survival, was putting together pieces that the men around her were missing. "Dad," she said quietly, "the folder, the documents, do you have copies?" Frank nodded grimly. "Hidden in 12 different places. Insurance policy." "And the test results? The medical records they've been keeping on me?" "Got those too." Clara looked at Wyatt and he saw something fierce and determined in her eyes. "The barn. Your grandfather's old storm cellar. Is it still functional?" Wyatt nodded, not sure where she was going with this. "Can it hold 3 people for, say, 6 hours? Clara, what are you thinking?" She was already moving, surprising both men with her sudden decisiveness. "I'm thinking we don't run, and we don't fight. We disappear long, enough for the whole world to know what happened here." From her backpack, the same one she'd carried when she first appeared by Miller's Creek, Clara pulled out a small digital camera and what looked like a satellite phone. "Where did you—" Wyatt started. "I've been documenting everything. Since I got here," Clara said, her fingers flying over the devices. "Every conversation, every revelation. I started because I wanted proof of what my father had done to me, but now—" She looked up at him with fierce determination. "Now we have proof of everything." Frank was staring at his daughter, as if seeing her for the first time. "Jesus, girl, how long have you been planning this?" "Since I was 15 and started wondering why government doctors cared so much about my blood work," Clara replied, still working frantically. "I've been collecting evidence for 4 years, waiting for the right moment." She looked at her father with a complex mixture of anger and understanding. I just never knew you were trying to protect me in your own screwed-up way. The tactical team was at the porch now. Through the windows they could see Sheriff Crawford approaching with a megaphone. "This is Sheriff Crawford. I need everyone to come out with their hands visible. No one needs to get hurt today." Clara finished her uploads and looked at both men. "In about 30 seconds, everything we just learned is going to be on every major news outlet in the country. Government conspiracy, environmental cover-up, medical experimentation on civilians, it's all going live." She held up the satellite phone, showing them a screen filled with uploading files. "My insurance policy. I've been sending updates to investigative journalists for months, but I was missing the big picture." She looked at Frank. "Until today." The phone beeped. "Upload complete." "And now," Clara said with grim satisfaction, "we're not loose ends anymore. We're witnesses the whole world is watching." Sheriff Crawford's voice came again, but this time it carried a note of uncertainty. "Wyatt, I need you to come out and talk to me." "He knows," Frank said with amazement. "Somehow he knows what you just did." Clara smiled, and for the first time since Wyatt had known her, it was the smile of someone who held all the cards. "Because I just sent him a copy too." The next few hours would be chaos, federal agents arriving to find their carefully managed cover-up exploding across social media, Environmental Protection Agency investigators demanding access to the contaminated land, medical professionals asking hard questions about decades of civilian testing, and in the middle of it all, three people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, united by truth and the desperate hope that sometimes, just sometimes, the truth was enough. But even as the helicopters retreated and the news vans arrived, even as the first environmental cleanup crews began suiting up to examine the North pasture, Clara kept the satellite phone close. Because she'd learned something else in those 4 years of secret investigation. The conspiracy was bigger than just one ranch in Montana, much bigger, and in her final upload, she'd included a list of 12 other locations, 12 other families, 12 other cover-ups that were about to come to light. The government had spent 60 years burying secrets. Clara Whitmore had just dug them all up in a single morning. But as the dust settled and the initial chaos died down, as Wyatt held her close and Frank awkwardly tried to rebuild a relationship with the daughter he'd terrorized in the name of protection, none of them noticed the black sedan that remained parked on the hill overlooking the ranch. Inside that sedan, a woman in an expensive suit was making phone calls, her voice calm and professional, as she activated contingency plans that had been in place for decades, because the government had backup plans for their backup plans, and Clara Whitmore had just become the most wanted woman in America, wanted alive for now, but that could change very quickly. The conspiracy she'd exposed was just the beginning. The real secrets, the ones that could topple governments and rewrite history books, were still buried, and somewhere in Washington, D.C., in a room that didn't officially exist, a decision was being made about just how far they were willing to go to keep those secrets buried. 6 months later, the Lazy W Ranch looked different in the spring morning light. Environmental cleanup crews had been working the North pasture for months, slowly excavating decades of buried chemical weapons and contaminated soil. The process would take years to complete, but for the first time in generations, the land was beginning to heal. Wyatt stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching Clara work with the new cattle in the South pasture. The North pasture would never be suitable for grazing again, but the government settlement had been generous enough to buy twice the acreage he'd lost. More importantly, it had come with a public apology and a guarantee of medical monitoring for everyone in the affected area. Clara had become something of a folk hero. Her story, the abused daughter who uncovered a decades-long conspiracy while falling in love with the man whose family had been its unwitting guardians, had captured the public imagination. Book deals and movie offers poured in daily. She turned them all down, preferring to focus on the congressional testimony that had resulted in new laws governing environmental cleanup and civilian protection. Frank Whitmore was serving a reduced sentence at the county jail, his cooperation with federal investigators earning him leniency. More surprisingly, he'd become a model prisoner, using his time to write letters to his daughter, not asking for forgiveness, but simply trying to explain the impossible choices he'd made and the love that had motivated them, however poorly expressed. Clara visited him once a week. Their relationship would never be simple or easy, but they were building something new on the ruins of what trauma had created. Understanding, if not forgiveness. Acceptance of complexity, if not absolution. The healing isn't just happening in the soil. Dr. Sarah Chen, the family therapist working with Clara and Frank, observed in her professional assessment. Generational trauma, like environmental contamination, affects everything it touches. But with proper treatment, with acknowledgement of the damage and commitment to change, recovery is possible. It's slow, it's difficult, but it's real. The conspiracy had unraveled exactly as Clara had predicted. 12 other families came forward with similar stories. Environmental cleanup sites were established across 4 states. Medical monitoring programs were expanded. Criminal charges were filed against officials who had known about the contamination and chosen cover-up over cleanup. But perhaps most importantly, the story had sparked a national conversation about the price of secrets, about the difference between security and secrecy, about the responsibility governments have to the people they serve. Wyatt had learned something profound about love in those months. He'd thought love was about protection, about shielding the people you care.